So here we are, another episode of ShiftED podcast. Um, Today I am just reaching not too far over to Concordia University, where I have Shannon Bell coming in. She is a part of the Quebec English-speaking communities research network. And Shannon, I'm going to butcher this, but I want to try. QUESCREN. QUESCREN.
QUESCREN, yes.
QUESCREN. Cool. I love acronyms. Yeah. I saw Shannon do a lunch and learn webinar on challenges in early learning and childcare for Quebec English-speaking communities, and we're going to get into that research. But Shannon, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what you do, how did you get to this stage in your career? What were some of the pinnacle moments that kind of, weaved your journey to where you are now?
That is a great question, and I often answer it with, how much time do you have? Because it's been a long journey. But I will say I am originally from the US, and I moved here a little over 10 years ago and found myself plopped into the English-speaking minority quite quickly, quite immediately. And, just anecdotally looking into community activities, I was able to find, some friendship there. And then through that, I found, my first job. It was, looking for a job in English at the time. But my educational background is that I was a journalist. I studied journalism as an undergrad, worked for newspapers and magazines. And then coming here, realized that I needed to get some French under my belt real quick. And so I finished my master's in public administration at Concordia. And so I was interested in the community sector from the get-go. And my first job was at the Yellow Door in Montreal, which is an intergenerational community organization. And I'm now on the board there. So I'm still really involved. I really love that organization. And everything that they do. But, this idea of linguistic policy was always at the forefront of my Quebec existence. And so I, for better or worse, that's how I ended up here. And then after we spent about 5 years in Montreal when I first moved here, my husband's Francophone from Quebec, we went to Trois-Rivières because he returned to school, and there was a program there only offered in Trois-Rivières. And there I started working at a community organization that is under the umbrella of the CHSSN community organizations. And so I was a liaison between the CIUS, the local CIUS, and the English-speaking community. And so that was a really wonderful experience where I learned a lot about the history of English-speaking Quebec and, how we got to where we are today, and just a really on-the-ground experience. Met some really great people working within the sector as well. So
right.
That was a really big eye-opening experience for me as far as the community sector goes. And then I worked at universities and in various capacities. We moved to Sherbrooke, so we live in Sherbrooke now, even though I work from a distance with Concordia. And so I worked at Bishop's for a time. And then I saw this opening for this research project going on at QUESCREN, and I was just like, oh, I have to do that, So I've been with QUESCREN for almost 2 years now, working on this research briefs project.
Amazing. And did you have French coming up to Quebec? Were you able to, I saw this research that said only 2% of people living in Quebec have no understanding of French. I mean, it's a very, very low percentage.
It is.
Were you functionally French when you first moved up from the States?
Not functionally, but I did just coincidentally in high school took French instead of what most people took was Spanish, because I lived in New Mexico, and that was sort of the second language that made the most sense for a lot of people. But I was always interested in French, and so I had what you might call a base. I knew more than just 1 through 10 and hi, how are you? So when I arrived in Quebec, I was able to go straight to the more intermediate courses and really learn to be functionally conversational. But it took, for me, it was the really valuable thing was having a partner who's Francophone, and all
Right.
of our friends were Francophone. And so I
Mm.
was like immediately immersed in Francophone culture, music, movies, my husband's friends, you couldn't operate in English in that atmosphere. You really had to speak French. And
Right,
so
for sure.
it came that way. Really just, yeah,
Mm.
personally that way, rather than I did take the immigrants French classes that were
Right,
offered by the Ministry of Immigration.
right,
That was a
right,
good program. They were free. It
right.
was really high quality, I found. And so I got a lot of good base there. And then the rest is like, like they all say, you just got to
Mhm.
live in it, right? And
That's right. That's right. That's right.
so that's what I
Well, it's
did.
amazing too now that you're kind of delving into English language research here within Quebec, which I mean, it's really fascinating. Like as an English speaker, I was born, raised here, not knowing all that stuff, and that's what struck me
Yeah.
so much when I saw the Lunch and Learn is that how
Yes.
little I knew about the foundations and how the educational system got started and all that. And we'll
Yeah.
jump into that. But what brought you to QUESCREN? Like, what was it about that offering that you saw that sparked something new that you wanted to go for that?
I think it had that perfect blend of professional goals that I had for myself and personal experience.
Mm,
You want to be able to bring something to your professional role, something that makes sense for you, and how you identify with your professional role. And I think that for me, I really need a cause. That was always kind of my driving force behind my education. I was like, I need to work for a cause, whatever the cause is. It didn't even matter what it was. I just need a cause. I wanted to work in the public sector, in the community sector. And this just made so much sense because I feel a part of the cause a little bit. You feel like
right.
you're working towards something that is going to help people that you know and people whose
Mm,
experiences and challenges you have also experienced and have know those challenges. So I think that it was really important for me to get back into the community sector after having left it briefly to work at Bishops. And it's just
mm,
something that was that fulfillment that can be twofold, right? Because sometimes you're working in these situations where you're like, am I having an impact? Is any of it
mm,
working? And it can feel like an uphill battle a lot of the
for sure.
time. But
Mm, mm,
there's just nothing better than feeling like you're working toward a common goal or, something for the betterment of the community at large. And so that was what
absolutely.
really drew me to QUESCREN. And then the research part was just something I'd always been wanting to get into. So I have done some research in my master's, but never like
Mm,
professionally. But I had
mm,
worked in the community sector. And so this job post was a perfect like
mm,
marriage of those two things, like knowledge of the community sector, the English speaking community, and having, experience academically with writing and reading. Because this project,
mm,
it's important to note, it's secondary research. So I'm not conducting new research. I'm go what is essentially literature review. So I'm looking at research that's been done in any given
mhm,
topic, and I'm putting it together and making it, accessible for anybody, whether
right.
it's a government official or a community worker or just a member of the community. If you can look at it, you're not going to spend too much time. It's not a deep dive. It's a
Mm,
broad, understanding of a particular topic and there's context for today. There's, if necessary, historical context put in there so that someone can look at that and like get a pretty good understanding of the global picture.
well,
And so
I'm
that's
sure your journalism work too at your younger age is also informed that practice as well, right? Because I mean, in essence, journalism does a lot of that where you're finding stuff, and then is there a pattern? Is there something that is popping
yeah,
out from the research that was
exactly.
done? Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's,
cool.
and you may ask my employers that they might say that that was actually one of the reasons they decided to hire me for this is because of that
Cool.
very angle that I could take with it. I
Mm-hmm.
used to looking at a bunch of stuff that maybe not everybody wants to look at, some pretty dense academic material, and bringing that into a document that, just makes sense of all of it. And so like I'm kind
Yeah.
of doing heavy lifting for you, essentially, is the idea
Right.
behind that. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think too, like some of the research that you were doing anyway with the early the challenges in the early childhood learning, it had that kind of idea of simplifying things for people and kind of like giving them that information as well. That I mean, you'd have to sift through quite a bit of stuff to be able to get the information that you presented to us. So I
Yeah.
totally like, and I think in a way too, that those are some of the aha moments of you kind of knew about this and that and this and that, but assembled together in this story, in this picture really kind of spoke to me,
Yeah.
in a really cool way. Like I loved it.
Well, I'm glad
Um,
that you got something out of it. That's good. Job
absolutely.
accomplished.
There you go. Well, and I also like your comment on sometimes it feels like, are we making a difference? I'm one person in this huge lake of, it
Hmm.
can kind of I feel that at times too as an educator. Like you seem,
Oh,
you
yeah.
work really hard and you put so much effort and
Mhm.
love and attention, and you're like,
Mm.
hope it helps.
Yeah. Well, and as an educator, I'm sure you've heard what they say about, if you can reach one child, you've done your work, or you can say that
Right.
you've accomplished something. And so I guess I would say it's probably similar for the research world. If you can reach one person who understands better some subject, then you've done your part, at least in, a little bit.
Absolutely. Could you tell us a little bit about the organization? I mean, you kind of you're tiptoeing around it a bit, but like, what's the function of the Quebec English speaking community research network? Is it to do as you were saying, where you're gathering lots of research from that is out there and then making it accessible for people? Is that the main um, crux of what the organization does?
Yeah, so we kind of like to consider ourselves a sort of one-stop shop for research and information on English speaking Quebec. So we do that in many different ways. We have a lot of resources. We have, for example, we have what we call the bibliography on English speaking Quebec. So you can go on our website and you can search thousands and thousands of publications, scholarly works, articles, anything mentioning English speaking Quebec. Like, it's a great resource. So that's something we host. We have the Community Knowledge Open Knowledge Library, which is another database that you can search to find great literature that comes out of community organizations. And then we also have a researcher member network, which connects other academics working on things that might be interesting to English speaking Quebec, and they can communicate. We can promote their work. We also host forums and academic conferences, and then we have our in-house produced research as well as some commissioned research that we'll do. We'll have some funding to get some researchers to do some briefs or a working paper or something like that. So we're also producing research, but we're also like bringing it all into a hub. So we look at
Mm,
ourselves as kind of a hub for information on, and with the goal being to understand English
right.
speaking Quebec. How does it exist within the greater province, and how does it also exist within other OL and OMLCs, we call it, official linguistic minority communities in Canada.
Mm.
How does it exist in all these different landscapes? And so
Wow.
that's really what we're about.
Amazing. What a great resource
Yeah.
for us to have. Because, I mean, I'm sure it informs a lot of stuff. I mean, not just policy, but, education, how we go about it, being
Yeah.
aware of. And maybe we'll shift over to your research because there's so many great examples in it. Um, but what I found really interesting, so like I said before, there was this lunch and learn, and Shannon was doing the webinar, and it was about challenges in early learning and childcare for Quebec's English speaking community. And I loved your laying out kind of how it all evolved from the 80s to the 90s to nowadays. Could you walk us through how early child care has kind of evolved here in Quebec since the 80s?
Yeah, so that for me, especially as just a consumer of information, I find it easier to start, some beginning point. You have to decide on what that beginning point will be. But
Right.
a lot of the research that I looked at was the starting point of that seemed to be talking about the 70s, and the
Mm.
80s. And, this idea of, going from just when women started working outside of the home, that's when we started seeing a need for childcare for, obvious reasons. And
Right.
so the evolution, my brief looks at the evolution of just simple childcare, like essentially what we might think of as like babysitting,
Mm.
to educative care. So we know there's actually
Right.
a program being implemented. We're looking at development of the child
Mm.
and preparing them for school. And
Right.
so those programs really started coming out more in the 70s and the 80s when research was looking at child development.
Mm. Mm.
And so in Canada, that's, it's kind of the Western world in general. That's what was happening.
Mm.
And they started as like two different things, right? You had your childcare, and then you had like what we would call something a bit more fancy, kind of elitist, like the fancy childcare, that those would have the developmental programs. And then you would have
Mm.
programs that were meant for children who were perhaps facing socioeconomic challenges, or they have developmental problems. So that's how there were like two tracks of programs up through the 90s. And then you started seeing a convergence of the two. We'll put them all under one umbrella, and we'll develop programs for everyone that's meant to be addressing both like regular development of a child, and also trying to bring up anybody who might have some challenges, and we're addressing those challenges too. And so this is
Mm.
all called early learning and child care, and it includes like the preschool programs. And so in the 90s, late 90s, you started seeing a need for, well, society was like looking for ways to do this in an affordable way, and
Right.
something that everybody could access. So in
Mm.
Quebec, we have our sort of what a lot of us look at as a flagship program, which is the Centre pour la petite enfance, the CPEs, and
Right.
that became such a big example for the rest of Canada, that we were
Mm.
able to, not without its flaws. There were obviously a lot of people who pointed out those flaws that were very
Sure.
valid points, but it's such a huge project that actually succeeded in being implemented, with a standard rate. Basically, it goes up every year, but there's one flat
Okay.
rate for every family,
That's it.
depending, no, it has nothing to do with your socioeconomic status.
Mm-hmm.
And so meaning that it's universal, everyone can go. The obvious big problem that we have today with that is that there's just not enough places for
Right.
every child, even though every child technically has a right to it.
Mm.
And then that's resources. And so those are the challenges we're looking at today. Continues to be an issue of resources, and that's across the board, whether we're talking about the actual Centre de la petite enfance, or if you're talking about other educative or like professional resources, like
Okay.
education and speech pathology, just across the board. And
Right.
linguistic, not even linguistic problem. There's just not enough resources for everyone.
Wow.
So that's what the brief kind of looks at, like,
Yeah.
who's suffering the most from this? Suffering is a big word. Who are facing the most challenges, and
Right.
what can we do? What's being done, if anything at all, and what can we
Mm.
do in the future?
What were some of those the current efforts that were being made to kind of, I know with the new cycle program in preschool where they open it up to 4-year-olds, so it's a 4-5 cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Was that intent? I mean, if you can answer this based on what you've observed, was that intent to open up more spaces, or like, because
Yeah.
I also know like the 4 and 5s, they are off on the summer, right? So if you are working, um, what do you do once summer hits? You got 3 months where you're going to have to find, and those spots, if you give them up, are like, they seem to be
Yeah.
like these gems now. Like you just don't give them up.
Right,
Like
right. Yeah, you're talking about the
did the psych?
K4, right?
Yeah,
K.
that's right. Did that program, when they opened that, I think it's maybe 3 years or 4 years old, where they started bringing in the
Yeah.
fours. Was there a noticeable change in spots being available?
Right. So the K4 program is interesting from what I found out from this project is that it's actually existed in different ways since the 70s.
Okay.
Originally it was it was exclusively in neighborhoods that we work with socioeconomic challenges. And so to add some help with developmental challenges that might be having problems or accessing affordable daycare. They were
Mm.
really limited to those areas. And then with the CAC government, they made an objective of making K4 universal, so that it with the largely to address the problem with not having enough places in the CPEs,
Right.
because that was a huge thing that people were excuse me, my cough comes. That was a big thing that people were a big challenge. So the problem with that, again, was resources. So they had this
Okay.
great objective, but there weren't enough teachers qualified to implement these programs. And so they have opened a lot of them.
Mm.
But one of the things that I saw, an article I read for this, was that they then were kind of, I don't know, poaching is not the right word, but I just said it anyway. Educators from the daycares were then going to
Right.
the K4 programs. Um,
Yes.
because they were looking for people who were qualified, and even then there was a question of qualifications, because the qualifications to be an educator in a daycare are not the same qualifications to be a
Right.
teacher in a primary school, which is essentially
Right.
what K4 is. It's primary school.
That's it.
And
Yeah.
so there were quite a few challenges. Yes, there were more places, but then there was also the issue of being able to actually meet the
Right.
objective, which they
Right.
haven't yet.
Wow.
So um,
Right.
they're
And
trying.
they were
It's definitely effort.
they were saying by 2029 they want 2,600 K4 classrooms, right? And
That's what
are
they were
they?
saying, yeah.
Is that a realistic? I mean, I
That's,
guess it's hard to tell the future, right?
it is hard, yeah. I mean, it doesn't, I mean, if at the rate they're going, who knows?
A
They've
lot of
had to cut
classrooms.
back. Yeah, they've had to cut back clearly so far.
Yeah.
There have been some programs to incentivize educators working in CPEs to get some other certifications.
Hmm.
So while they're there's like a work program. So
Okay.
while they're working a couple of hours at a CPU, for example, they can become, based on some other criteria, I don't remember exactly what it is, they can be enrolled in some programs where they're, getting continuing education, basically working toward a
Okay.
certificate that will allow them to work if they wanted to in a K4 program, or work full time, because the CPEs have a different way of, they have a special way of their qualifications. They have to have a certain number of qualified educators for the number of kids, for a certain number of kids as a ratio, but not
Okay.
every person, not every employee in the CPE has to be as
Hmm.
qualified. So
Okay.
some of these other, sometimes they're part-time, they'll those are the kind of people who would maybe be interested in these kind of programs to obtain a certification in order to work full-time in a CPE, or perhaps in another kind of program. So there are
Hmm.
tools being implemented. They're
Right.
trying, efforts are being
Right.
made, but who knows how long it'll take to really achieve the lofty objectives that they have.
Right. Right. And
Mhm.
what are like the greatest surprises that you encountered as you were kind of going through this, or things that you didn't expect to find, or that you were like, yeah, that's quite obvious? Like, or were there some
Yeah.
of those occasions that you could share?
Definitely, like particularly with this, I mean, throughout this whole project, all the different topics that I've looked at, I've had a couple of like whoa moments. But if just talking about this particular brief, I would say that something I found really interesting was when looking on the website, the web registries of daycares, the La Place 05. I
Hmm.
was finding that while the website itself is available in English, you can click and have the English version. You can't sort any of the facilities by like English language. The way that it works,
Okay.
they do have a filter system, and this is some primary research, quote unquote, that I did myself. As a parent as well, I was familiar with the site.
Right.
But you can filter your results by several different types of criteria. Whether the CPE or the daycare facility does, outdoor activities, or, like or if they have cloth diapers, and then criteria is multi-linguistic groups. And so that was the only criteria that you can check to potentially find information on a facility that maybe they offer services in a language other than French. And it's definitely multilingual, so it's not, it's like any kind of, it could be any language, it could be Spanish, you know. So definitely nothing that you can look at that's English specific. And then also, from what I can tell, these facilities are the ones that are sourcing the information on the website about themselves. So there's no like standardized process from the site, you know, to be able to sort by these different things. It's like if the CPE says they have that, you know, they check the box or whatever. So it's kind of an informal way of sorting. And so it's definitely, I could see that being a challenge for potentially a unilingual English speaker looking for a service, you know, can I send my kid to daycare? Because what's also very interesting is that the CPE network and the daycare network, the early childhood education network, is not governed by Bill 101. It is under the Ministère de la Famille, which is kind of obvious, I guess, but I think we're so in those conversations about education and Bill 101, we kind of, you could potentially forget that it's not falling under there. So theoretically, an English-speaking parent like myself who doesn't have the right to English education for my child because I'm an immigrant, and my husband is French-speaking from Quebec, I could theoretically send my kid to an English-speaking daycare. I could, because, you know, Bill 101 doesn't apply there. But am I going to find one? Possibly not. You know, the way that the search criteria is set up, I may not find. So that was really interesting. I mean, it was something that I also experienced personally, but to really see it in action. And, you know, in order to verify this, I called up the Ministère de la Famille and I had a conversation with the person who answered the phone. How do you open a CP in English? Can you open a CP in English? You know, and they were like, first of all, I think a bit jarred by my question, but very kind and very, you know, willing to answer my questions. And they said, well, there's nothing to say that you can't do that, but we're not, you know, all your communication, your correspondence with the government must be in French. You must still correspond with the parents in French first. So, you know, you must follow all of the regular linguistic laws. But if you want to offer reading time in English at your CPE, you know, go ahead, kind of a thing, you know. So learning about how that system works and how different it is from the rest of the educational system was really interesting, I found.
Yeah, because you think, like logically, maybe, you know, like, okay, we can just choose. Are you sure about that? I like the way you described it too. If you choose to, there's nothing stopping you.
Right.
How would I know that information if I wasn't asking?
Exactly. You kind of have to ask. It's not necessarily, you're not going to accidentally stumble upon it, probably.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, some of your research pointed to the Place 05. Like, it's hard to understand that, as you were alluding to. And I think you said like 50% of first-time users of it encounter difficulty, which is a huge percentage. Like, very discouraging, I would assume too, if, you know, you're a first-time parent and you're trying to look at schools, and it's like, I've heard a lot of those stories too from friends and colleagues as well. Really fascinating.
That data actually came from the Institut de la Statistique de Quebec. So that's the province, you know, a provincial organization that is theoretically aware of this. So I don't know what efforts are being made to address that, but it's definitely not just on a linguistic basis. A lot of families are having.
Well, I mean, I think the work that you guys do is so necessary because it can be very daunting, particularly if you don't even know where to start, you know, like it's and there's stuff everywhere, you know, and it, like, I love the idea that you've gone through and kind of like, here are some things to be aware of. Here's, you know, this is what we know, and here's some solutions that we're trying to develop. I mean, it only is great stuff for our community, for sure. So I thank you guys for pursuing that. Maybe just to wrap, Shannon, what's next for you? Like, I mean, this research was really great. I mean, it's informed me for my practice in helping and supporting teachers and consultants as well.
Oh, it's great.
What are some other research that you guys are working on now that you could tell us about, that you're allowed to tell us about?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, no, I'm always happy to talk about upcoming things. I
Hmm.
am working at the moment on another brief that talks about community vitality research and how we can apply it to English-speaking Quebec. So first of
Hmm.
all, just understanding what is community vitality research. It's something we hear a lot, words we hear thrown around a lot in conversations about our community. As a linguistic minority, we hear like vitality. This word is thrown around a lot.
Hmm.
Exactly is that? And it's a big area of research. There's a big body of it, not only just about English speaking Quebec, but just, communities in general. And they have measurement, units of measurement. How do we tell the health, and the vitality of a community by certain criteria? So looking at
Hmm.
that has been really interesting. And so I'm excited to be able to share that. That'll be coming out next spring.
Awesome.
I'm also working on, in a similar vein of the early childhood education, I'm looking at programs for older adults, seniors, how, what kind of challenges they're facing in
Hmm.
terms of public services, healthcare access, those kinds of things. And then actually a colleague of mine is working on one about identity. We had talked briefly
Huh.
about, how do Anglophones or English speakers in Quebec perceive themselves? Um,
Hmm.
and what is identity, and this idea
Yeah,
of
I've heard
defining
about
that.
that coming out. I that hasn't dropped yet, right? But it's on its way.
That's right. No, it's not out yet, but
Cool.
all of these, like the project we're working on now, this goes through March of next year. So there's going
Okay.
to be just like a bunch of things coming out
Amazing.
just before March. But yeah, so we have some on immigration and healthcare as well. So all the good topics. We'll have a little
Amazing.
something for everyone to learn about there. Yeah.
Well, I recommend the listeners out there to attend one of these lunch and learns that Concordia offers. I'll put the link in this podcast describer because they're really good. They're well done. And again, thank you, Shannon, for just making us smarter. I think the work that you do makes us smarter and allows us to be aware of our identity and how we fit into this multicultural shifting province of ours, in
Yeah.
education in particular too, which is really fascinating. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, and I'm always happy to talk about what we're up to. And we actually have our Education and Vitality Forum next year that we're in the process of putting together. So there's always
Well,
more
I
to
will.
learn, more people to come together and share their knowledge. So, but yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Cool. Well, I'll reach back out for sure. I mean, we'll see this as the beginning of our conversation and not the end.
Yeah, sounds
So we'll
great.
have Shannon back on eventually. So thanks again. It's a lot
Thank
of
you.
fun.